Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is June 3rd, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the transfer portal. There was a new rule that was put into place that would give guys like Cam Rising and McCoy one more year to figure out what they want to do at the next level and possibly build out that resume a little bit more. Then we'll get into one of the most popular guys at the SEC meetings last week, Jimmy Sexton, one of the most powerful people in college football. If you don't know the name, you definitely should, and we'll get into why that is so important here in the second segment. Then we'll talk about Texas a little bit. We got into why Oklahoma, I think, is sort of ready for the SEC, might need a couple of years to get really fully involved, but Texas seems like they're ready to roll. But are they fully ready? We'll figure out in the third segment here today. And then we have a little bit of a recruiting update. We're coming off a huge weekend with a ton of official visits that I want to break down for all of you. And then we got a Good Vibes Monday to finish it off. And we're going to talk about some of the players that have a ton to gain from this year, especially in the NFL level. Definitely a lot of guys that can make a ton of money. No two ways about it. So we'll definitely break that down towards the end. Before we jump in, though, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have kind of a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's good for all of us. But let's jump right in and let's talk about this new transfer portal rule because it's a little bit wild. No two ways about it. We talked about all of the different changes that are going on and how some of the NCAA rules that have been in place are not necessarily as ironclad as they would like them to be, and this is one of them. So it sounds like double transfers are going to be able to, at least if you are a double transfer where you had to sit out a season, it looks like you're going to get that season back. It sounds like in one of the court of laws, I believe, the United States Department of Justice actually ruled that this was not a rule that they could enforce and something that absolutely had to be given back to the athletes. So guys like Cam Rising, guys like McCoy, we'll get into all of those and break down why it's such a big deal for them. But this is obviously a really, really huge thing. It's something that a lot of people in college football, fans and coaches included, are a little bit perturbed by, people being able to stay until they're 25, 26 and be, real veterans in college football is obviously kind of a new phenomenon with COVID years and medical red shirts and all of the different things that have happened over the last couple of years. But it is one of those things that gives all these guys kind of a second shot. Most of the guys that I'm about to talk about have definitely, struggled with a lot of injuries, with, transferring to a new school and having to sit out when they really wanted to play. So a lot of this is, a good thing for those players, but it is another, I suppose, indicator of where the NCAA was at a couple of years ago. And it was essentially, they were in catch-up mode, and they absolutely shouldn't have been, but that's the place they were in. We added NIL into the conversation. We've talked about it pretty much ad nauseum at this point, that it could have been set up in a place where NIL was brought into the picture and we didn't have this remarkable turmoil around the sport. Now, we were going to have things change. We were going to have kind of interesting, awkward conversations, no doubt about that. But I think there was a way to make it at least a little bit more seamless than it was, which it was not seamless by any means. And I think the transfer portal is kind of the same way. They were not prepared for the full onslaught that was going to happen after some of the rules changed, and it happened very quickly. And I think it's one of those things where if the NCAA was 2-3 years ahead of this and started to plan for the eventuality of once you start giving players some rights, once you start giving players NIL money and different things to earn, they're going to start utilizing that. And some of that comes in the form of them moving schools pretty often. So I think this is, another moniker of the NCAA is not necessarily the entity that you want it to be right now. And it wasn't a couple of years ago. And right now, they're just playing catch-up and dealing with lawsuits and all of the fallout of some things that they could have prevented in a lot of ways. So this is obviously going to be a fascinating rule, but let's break down some of the guys that are going to benefit the most from this rule. Will Backus over at CBS broke down a couple of big-time guys, and I'm sure more and more will start to come out of the woodwork because, as we know in college football, there's always a couple of guys that kind of pop up out of nowhere and make a real big name for themselves. So we'll definitely break those guys down as we get there, but I do want to start with Cam Rising. He feels like the obvious answer here. He feels like the guy that I think has the most to gain. There's no two ways about that. He obviously suffered a number of injuries throughout his career, kept him out all of last season with a bad injury that it felt like we were all just kind of waiting for the news that he was going to start that day, and it just never came. So, obviously, a terrible situation for him, but way back in the day, he transferred over from Texas after his freshman year and had to sit a year, and that obviously is something that he's going to get that year back now. And we saw Michael Penix. We've seen that NFL teams can absolutely overlook some health issues in the past, but you have to show them that you can be healthy for an extended period of time. If for Michael Penix, it was 2 years. For Cam Rising, it could be 2 years as well, starting this year and then the following. So he's one of those guys that, is a very, very good game manager, is very smart on the football field, can do a lot of really, really incredible things. So I don't necessarily think it's crazy to think that, say he comes back for the next 2 years. They win the Big 12 both those years. They go to the playoff. He's the leader of that, charge and does really incredible things. I'm not saying he's going to be, a first-round pick or anything crazy like that, but there's definitely NFL teams that would take a, flyer on him and give him a shot to succeed at the next level, because I think this is a very talented kid that just has gotten clipped at pretty much every turn where he was really starting to heat up. So I'm really excited to see what he can do for these next 2 years. I like to think that he'll probably stick around after 2024, barring some remarkable season from him, which is on the table, but definitely someone that benefits from this a lot. One guy that I think is really interesting in all of this is Brew McCoy. He has had one of the most fascinating college careers in quite some time. He committed to USC in high school and was committed to them for quite some time. Decommitted very shortly before signing day. Decided to sign with Texas. He was in Austin for about the length of a lunch, and then decided to make his way back to USC for a year before transferring to Tennessee. And he's been at Tennessee for a couple of years. He had to sit out 1 year. He's had some injury troubles throughout his career, but this is a big body, physical receiver, a guy that can block on the outside, a guy that can do the jump balls. Is a competent route runner, but not necessarily the strongest thing in his tool chest. But at the end of the day, a very, very physical receiver that has an NFL body. So when you look at him, if he can get it going this year and be a big piece of that offense with Nico Iamaleava, and then with some of the guys that are going to walk out the door, I assume Squirrel White will likely put his name into the NFL draft after this year. He's going to be an even bigger part in 2025, and I think that's really where you could see him kind of shoot up those boards, especially because that's when you'll have Iamaleava in his second year starting, that is, and he'll be a little bit more comfortable, and that offense could be incredibly potent with Brew McCoy right at the center of it. So very fascinating to watch this kid. I think the talent is off the charts. It's just a matter of him staying healthy, being on the field, and showing what his ability is. But another wide receiver here that is a little bit interesting. He's been kind of off the beaten path for a little bit here, where this is someone that came into Texas originally out of high school and had a really good freshman year. He was a fantastic player for them, might have been the best wide receiver on that team, maybe second to Devin Duvernay when they had Sam Ehlinger, and that was quite some time ago now, I know, but he has had a very interesting journey, has had some injuries, transferred over to Arizona State, and had to sit out a year, and definitely struggled with some different things throughout his career, but the kid's a very, very good route runner, and he does a lot of really good things on the field. He's a great slot receiver if you're looking for someone that's just sure-handed, maybe won't, take the top off or do anything remarkable, but is going to get you those 5 yards that you need, is going to be able to be a third down target that is super important. So this is someone that I really, really like. In fact, I think he's someone that kind of reminds me of kind of the Luke McCaffreys of the world, where the athleticism is really, really good. He's from the slot position, is going to be kind of a tactician at the next level, but is a very, very smart kid and can definitely play really good football. Just these next 2 years will be hugely important, and whoever's throwing him the ball at Arizona State will also be hugely important, which is something we'll definitely unpack throughout the season. But another one getting to the defensive side of the ball here is Darrell Jackson Jr. He's someone that didn't get to play a lot last year because of this rule, came over from, I believe, a very small school, if I'm not mistaken. I can't exactly remember where he came over from, but he's transferred a number of times throughout his career, had to sit out a year, and got to play in the Orange Bowl because that is technically a part of the next year that doesn't necessarily apply to these rules. So he was able to play in the Orange Bowl, made a couple of tackles, is going to be a very good player for them. And I think when you talk about the Florida State defensive line and what they've done with some remarkable transfers that have come through there, Odell Haggins is one of the best coaches at that position. So I think he's going to be remarkable. I think he's one of those players that maybe it's this season. Maybe he doesn't need the extra season to tack on to his college career to make it happen, because he's going to have to, fill a big void, obviously, with Braden Fisk walking out the door. But also, this kid's just really, really remarkable and can do a lot of really incredible things. So very excited to see what he can do. And then you have Tyler Brown, a very, very talented offensive lineman. This guy came over from Jackson State. He transferred into Jackson State to join Deion when he came over there, and then followed Deion on over to Colorado, but did have to sit last year, and that was a big blow to Colorado. This is probably the guy that they feel the most confident in going into this year on that offensive line. Definitely someone that they are going to build around at left guard. So he's a huge, huge piece of that. And I think when you look at this offensive line, it needs a huge turnaround. And I don't think we have any offensive line turnaround that doesn't have an anchor, that doesn't have a guy that you can go to no matter what, and you feel very confident that he's going to block the guy in front of him. I think Tyler Brown is going to be that guy for Colorado. So these next 2 years are going to be huge for him. I think he's going to be a guy that maybe is a huge reason that Colorado starts to take those steps forward that they absolutely need to, especially in the trenches. But then let's finish it out here with Zach Durfee, a very, very talented edge rusher. Was at Sioux Falls for a little bit. Actually went to North Dakota State his freshman year just for a semester, but didn't play football. Decided to then transfer to Sioux Falls, played football, kind of broke out in 2022 when he had 11 sacks for them, and then made his way over to Washington when Kalen DeBoer was still the head coach. He's still there, and he's someone that is very, very talented, definitely someone that could break out in 2024 and might not need that extra year, but definitely someone that when you sit out a year, you probably need a little bit to get your feet wet again, and this is a guy that could absolutely burst onto the scene and be the next, big-time edge rusher out of Washington, just like Braylon Trice this year. So this is obviously a fascinating rule. It's something that is going to be really interesting to watch unfold. Obviously, there are some players that I didn't unpack here that will absolutely benefit from this, but I think when you talk about this rule, I feel like your mind immediately goes to Cam Rising, because he's someone that has struggled from injuries and has had to transfer, and it has done some things that has been a little bit tough. And I think it's one of those things where the talent's there, the ability's there, and he's going to win a lot of football games, but you got to be on the field. And I think if he gets these 2 years under his belt where he's healthy and he leads them to possibly playoff berths, there's going to be NFL teams calling. There's no two ways about that. So, but we're going to take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the most popular guy at the SEC meetings this last week, Jimmy Sexton. And frankly, he's one of the most popular guys in all of the sport because he's one of the most powerful in all of the sport. So we'll break down him and why he is one of the most powerful guys in the sport right after this. So stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows with 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about a new transfer portal rule that will be very interesting to watch unfold. It sounds like some double transfers are getting one more year to stay in college football and possibly build out their NFL resumes. So that'll be a fascinating thing to watch, but let's talk about Jimmy Sexton here for a second. If you don't know the name, you will very, very shortly, and you probably should to go forward, because this is one of the most powerful guys in the sport. He has been that way for quite some time, is a very, very powerful agent, and represents about every big coach that you can think of, whether it's Steve Sarkisian, Lane Kiffin, Hugh Freeze, Kalen DeBoer, the list goes on and on. In fact, he covers 13 of the 16 coaches in the SEC. So Jimmy Sexton is doing just fine. And if you're talking about the SEC meetings last week, he was the star of the show. We knew that without Saban there was going to be a little bit of a void that had to be filled. And obviously, Kirby Smart filled some of that. But Jimmy Sexton might have been the most popular guy in Destin this past week. So he's someone that's going to be very, very fascinating to watch. I think he's someone that when you look at him and you feel kind of his energy, he's a very understated guy. In fact, John Talty was writing a piece about him over at the CBS, and he said this guy was kind of over just in a little restaurant, kind of eating his burger and bothering no one, but all the coaches just started to file in and pay their respects to the man that really does define a lot of what goes on in this sport. So this is a very fascinating guy, and I think when you look at what he has done in this game and what he has done across the agency world just in sports, it's just out of this world remarkable. He has totally cornered the SEC. He also has Dan Lanning. He also has Mike Norvell. He has incredible group of coaches as his clients right now, and it gives him a lot of power. There's no two ways about that. He's someone that when he shows up to SEC meetings, when he shows up to pretty much any room, everyone knows that he's there, and everyone knows that they got to please him just a little bit. So he's someone that's really, really fascinating. He's someone that, if you know college football, if you want to follow college football, he's a name you'd likely have to know, because he holds as much power as you could possibly imagine. I think he's someone that, you probably don't see very forward-facing very often, but that's kind of the way in college football. We have a lot of people behind some closed doors making a lot of big decisions, and Jimmy Sexton is one of those guys. So many of you likely know who he is, or I've heard stories about what he's done in the industry, but he's an absolute superstar. And one of the biggest things about him is this past offseason, when all of the stuff was going on, Nick Saban retires and Kalen DeBoer comes in and takes that job, and there's rumors flying around about who's going to take the job. Is it Dabo Swinney? Is it Steve Sarkisian? Is it Dan Lanning? Is it whoever else? All of those guys, actually, I don't know if Dabo is represented by Jimmy, but a lot of those guys are represented by Jimmy Sexton, and a lot of those guys got raises around that week. So basically, if we're talking about that week where Nick Saban retired, or that 48 hours really, between when Nick Saban retired and when Kalen DeBoer was hired, that was the most powerful guy in the sport. There's no two ways about that. He got Mike Norvell, he got Dan Lanning, he got Steve Sarkisian. All those dudes got a little bit of extra money, and it's not necessarily because they were really aggressively being considered for the job. I mean, Mike Norvell seemed to be really in on those conversations. It seemed like it was going to be Kalen DeBoer or Mike Norvell at the end of the day, but Steve Sarkisian and Dan Lanning, I don't think they were ever going anywhere. I think Bama knew that. I think they knew that. I think Jimmy Sexton knew that. But the reality is, it's a good time to get some leverage, that's for sure. And he definitely used that. And all of those coaches, to be fair, deserved a little bit of a raise after the seasons they've had in the past couple of years. But it is one of those things that it shows you the power this guy has, where he was flying all over the country dealing with Kalen DeBoer getting the Alabama job, but also getting raises for all of his guys in between. So this is a very fascinating guy. I think he's one of those guys that sits kind of behind closed doors and makes a lot of decisions that at least impact college football. I'm not necessarily saying he's in these rooms deciding what the rules are going to be, how you're going to enforce it, how the money from the house settlement is going to be divided. I don't think he's involved in that too much. But when you represent so many big-time coaches, when you are a big, big part of one of the most powerful conferences in the sport and one of the most powerful conferences in every college sport, you're definitely going to have someone to deal with, and you're definitely going to have a lot of ability to wield a lot of that power, especially, when he represented Nick Saban, and you walk in those rooms and that guy is the first guy that Nick Saban would call in some of these scenarios, and you don't want to be on that guy's bad side. So he's one of those guys that operates almost off energy. He walks into a room and everyone just straightens up just a little bit more. Everyone gets a little bit tentative. Everyone gets a little bit nervous. And by all accounts, he's a very, very nice guy, a very, amicable guy that a lot of people get along with. But when you have that type of power, when you have that type of pull around some of the big-time coaches in this game, you got to be nice to them. There's no two ways about that. And it's funny because when you look at college football today, there's obviously a lot of people behind closed doors that make a lot of decisions, and you never really know exactly who they are. Jimmy Sexton is one that is a little bit behind closed doors, but there's very few people that follow this sport very closely that don't know who this guy is, because they know what he holds, they know how important he is, they know just the power that he wields on a daily basis. And I think Greg Sankey knows that more importantly, because him and Greg Sankey, I'm sure, have had many conversations. I'm sure are very, very close. So he's one of those guys that's going to be very, very fascinating to watch. I'm not here to tell you how you should feel about him, frankly. I'm not fully sure how I feel about him. I think he's a fantastic agent. There's no two ways about that. He does about as good of work as anyone in the agency industry right now. But he is one of those guys that has a lot of power, and I don't know where his priorities lie, I suppose. Well, at the end of the day, they lie with his clients. So, to be fair, he's kind of just going about his business. But it is one of those things where you got to know the name, at the very least. You got to know, who the power brokers in this sport are. And this guy is right near the top of the list. And he's one of those big-time players in the future of college football. He's one of the big-time players, especially in the SEC, with all of the control he has over some of the coaches, over some of the higher-ranking people in the SEC. And I think he's not necessarily, out there to take over the sport or do anything crazy like that. I think he's just out there to be a good agent. But with that comes a lot of ability to dictate some of this stuff and to dictate some of the rules and some of the ways that people go about business. So it'll be fascinating to watch all of this. Obviously, we've seen some coaches start to, leave college football, start to push off into, new adventures, whether that's the NFL or retirement or whatever that looks like. And Jimmy Sexton is going to be a huge part of that conversation going forward, because he covers guys like Hugh Freeze, like Kirby Smart, who I don't necessarily think is going to be at Georgia for the next, 25 years. I think at some point he's going to find his way out, and it's probably going to be sooner than some Georgia fans want. I'm not necessarily saying it's going to be a couple years down the road. I think he's here for quite a while, but at the end of the day, I do think it's going to be a name that is as important as there is in the sport going forward. And he's someone that I don't know if he's going to be, in these rooms making concrete decisions about the future of the sport, but I do know that whenever he enters the room, people are going to at least cater to him just a little bit and definitely make sure that he is comfortable, make sure that his clients are comfortable, because that makes everything just go a lot smoother when you know that you have the agent of these big-time coaches. He doesn't, hate you is the kind of the big goal when you're talking about Jimmy Sexton these days. So this is a guy that is going to be very, very big part of what college football looks like going forward, because he's going to be a big part of what the SEC looks like going forward. And I think he's someone that when you look at him at face value, he's just an agent doing his job. He's just a guy that likes to make as much money as he can for his clients, and he does a really, really good job at doing that. But it is someone that you do need to know. As we get into this new era of college football, and there's so many new people kind of entering the conversation and getting a seat at the table to make some decisions, you should know their names at the very least, and you should know what they're about, and you should know at least a piece of what they're about. And it's definitely tough to peg this guy down, because he is such a kind of an enigma, such a powerful guy that a lot of people have a little bit of trouble pegging down, but a very, very fascinating guy, and definitely someone that is going to be a big-time power player going forward as he has been in the past. So he's a fascinating guy, definitely someone that we will watch throughout this next little bit, definitely someone that wields power that I don't think all of us fully understand right now. But at the end of the day, he's going to be really, really fascinating, and definitely someone that will define college football a little bit going forward. But we're going to take our second break here, and then we're going to talk about a little bit about Texas. We're going to get into, are they ready for the SEC? I think a lot of people are pegging them as one of the best teams in the country. So They should be, right? But there's definitely some concerns that I have, so I want to break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Jimmy Sexton and how he is one of the biggest power players in college football. He has been for quite some time, but as we get into this new era with a lot of changes coming, he's definitely a name that everyone should know. So, broke him down a little bit, but let's get into Texas, and let's talk about, are they ready for the SEC? This is a question that we asked with Oklahoma last week. It's a little bit of a precarious question to be asking around Oklahoma right now. Definitely a lot of questions going into 2024, but I feel pretty confident that Brett Venables and that staff can get everything where it needs to be going forward in the SEC. But let's talk about Texas here for a second, because they are a team that, when you look at the college football landscape right now, when you look at the teams that are up at the top, the teams that have every chance to make big-time noise this upcoming year, Texas is right there. When you talk, it's pretty much Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, Oregon. Those are the four teams that I've kind of set in their own little category going into this year as teams that are going to be really, really hard to beat and definitely are championship favorites. So Texas is right there. There's no two ways about that. They're coming off a great year where you went to a playoff. You won a Big 12 title. You got 12 wins for the first time since 2009. So a lot of things happened at Texas last year that hadn't happened in far too long if you were to ask a Texas fan. But at the end of the day, being back for Texas, quote unquote, the joke that everyone has made throughout this time, and well-founded joke most of the time, but it was never about, making it back 1 year. It was never about, making to the playoff and saying, wow, that was really fun, we're back in the conversation, and dust your hands and call it a day. It was always about the following year. It was always about, following that up and saying, it wasn't just a mirage last year. It wasn't just the stars aligning perfectly with Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy being incredible and some of the wide receiver group being as good as it was. All of that stuff, it wasn't a mirage. It was just, signs of what's to come. That is what this year is about. And I think when you get into the SEC, there's a lot of question marks. They are a team that can kick the door down. They are a team that can totally take over this conference and be right up there with Georgia when we talk about who is the class of the SEC. And there are a number of reasons for that. So let's start with kind of the positives around Texas, and there are a number of them. But then let's get to the worries that I have about this team. So the roster itself is one of the best in the country. There's no two ways about that. When Steve Sarkisian came into this program, they had 7 offensive linemen on scholarship on that team. That's not nearly enough. Now they're up to about 18. They've totally flipped that roster on its head. It is a much more complete, much deeper, much tougher, more SEC-ready roster than it ever has been before. Also, the infrastructure at Texas is as good as it is around the country. When you talk about this sport, it's changed so much, and the NIL and the transfer portal era have hurt a lot of big-time schools where it's not necessarily moving in the direction of your school when you have to fork over a ton of cash, when you have to, lure guys in the transfer portal to your school and to your city. It doesn't necessarily work as well for some schools. Now, for Texas, it works out perfectly. Texas has about as deep as pockets as anyone in the entire country, and you have Austin to pitch to some older guys that, it's a great city to live in. So it's one of those things where the game has moved away from other people, but it's moved exactly in the direction of Steve Sarkisian and the Texas Longhorns. And then you have recruiting, one of the best recruiting staffs in the entire country, and one of the best pitches in the entire country, especially after the playoff run. They've had top 5 classes the past 3 years, and they're shaping up to have another one this year with some remarkable wide receiver talent that we'll definitely get to into the next probably month or so as we unpack recruiting more. But the head coach, it feels like the last 2 times Texas has missed the mark. Charlie Strong and Tom Herman were not the guys to lead Texas back to the promised land, lead them back to where they want to be. It feels like that guy, Steve Sarkisian, is the one to do that. He has answered every single question that has been asked of him. When he walked in, there were some bumps. There's no two ways about that. That first season was a little bit off the walls. I'll be the first one to say that. But at the end of the day, he answered the bell. He has only improved since he's gotten there and has done really everything near perfectly since he's gotten to Texas. So it's been really remarkable to watch that turnaround. And then you have alignment, which is something that might be a little bit overlooked in the college football world. But when you have your college football head coach, you have your AD, and you have your president all on the same page about what you want to be as a program, the way you want to go about things in NIL, all of that stuff, you're pretty much unstoppable. It is a hugely important thing to college football, and it's something that hasn't happened at other schools and definitely has impeded their ability to get NIL and all of those things up to where they need to be to compete at a high level. So Texas has a lot of things going for them. There's no two ways about that. They have an incredible infrastructure, an incredible roster, a really good head coach in Steve Sarkisian, and you got to feel really good if you're a Texas fan going into this season. But I do have my worries, and they're a little bit abstract. I will say that. A lot of them aren't necessarily concrete ideas, because the reality is a lot of the concrete things you see at Texas are really good. If you look at it on paper, they are a national championship contender, and there's no question about it. Here's where my worry starts to kind of kick in, where this is the year, right? We talked about it earlier. This is the year where Texas doesn't just become a team that popped up. They become a team that is going to stick around for a while and that is going to be a player in the SEC and is going to be in the playoff most year and is going to compete for national titles and possibly win a couple in the coming years. So it's one of those things where last year they felt like a MLB player getting out of a slump, and they got a couple of hits. They're hitting the ball well, they're seeing the ball a little bit better. This year is when you start hitting bombs and you start going back to your normal ways. You start having those seasons that you're used to as an MLB player. So it's kind of like this is the coronation. This is the moment where Texas doesn't just become a team that had gotten back into the conversation, but a team that's going to stick around for a while there. And I think there's a lot of things that go into that. And the biggest thing is a lot of pressure. And especially when you're at Texas, there's a little bit added pressure. So someone like Quinn Ewers is under the immense amount of pressure of having to deliver, especially being a third-year starter, a lot of NFL hype, everything going into that for him. This is a huge year. This is a contract year, as they call it, for Quinn Ewers. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. Steve Sarkisian is someone who has not made many big missteps as the Texas head coach. He's done really, really incredible things. But for the first time as the Texas head coach, he's under the most pressure that you really can be, where a lot of fans are expecting a national title. A lot of fans are expecting them to win the SEC and, take over from Georgia and do some really remarkable things. And they're capable of doing all of those things. But Steve Sarkisian has not been in a position where he's had to head coach one of those teams, just plain period. He's been at some really good teams, and he's had a lot of success as an OC, and even as a head coach, he's done some really good things, but none of his teams have necessarily been looked at as national title contenders as a head coach. So that's going to be a totally different ballgame for him. It's going to be something that he's going to have to get used to, and hopefully he's able to, thrive under that pressure. But it's one of those things that you can let pressure affect you a number of different ways. If they, crumble under it and they kind of shy away from that moment, they're going to get pushed around in the SEC. I'll just be plain and honest with you. If they, really take advantage of it, really attack it, and are not scared of this challenge, they're going to be more than fine. There's no two ways about that. But Also, when you talk about the SEC, the biggest thing that Texas is going to have to adjust to is the schedule, plain and simple. When you talk about making that jump from the Big 12 to the SEC, you're playing two different ball games. And it's not to say that the Big 12 schedule wasn't difficult, because it is. You know, there are games in there that are sketchier than some people might think they are, and Texas struggled in some of those games last year. So when you look at this year, those games are going to be that much tougher. You know, you don't have a game against Iowa State, you have a game against Arkansas. You don't have a game against, Kansas, you have a game against Florida. So things get a little bit more interesting. I'll put it that way. There are definitely a lot more hurdles to get over, and when you talk about Texas, you have 4, 5, 6 weeks stretches that you're going to have to be on your A game every single week if you want to win that game. So there's a lot going into this season. I think when you look at Texas, on paper, they have so many talented players on offense. The defense is coming along the way that they hoped it would. A lot of things are in place for this team to be the next team that, maybe takes a little bit of charge in the SEC, maybe wins a couple of titles there, goes to the playoff a ton, and wins a national title. They can do all of those things in the next couple of years. But the reality is, they're going into uncharted territory, and they're going into an area where a lot of teams with a lot of success and a lot of hype have failed before them. So you can be a good team and go 6-6 in the SEC. You can be a great team and go 9-3. Texas wants to be elite. They want to go 11-1. They want to go 12-0. They want to be in Atlanta, and they want to go to the playoff. So all of these things, all of that pressure just continues to build, and from where I'm standing throughout spring, it seems like Steve Sarkisian and company are more than happy to take that pressure and deal with it the way they deal with it, which is play some really good football. So I'm not necessarily super worried about them, especially in year one. When you look at the roster that they have, it's going to be incredible. But the reality is, let's just say they fall on their face in year one. Let's just say it ends up being an 8-4 season, and some of the physicality of the SEC gets to them a little bit, and they're not necessarily the team that we expected coming in. Then things get a little bit interesting around Austin, Texas. Not necessarily, an entire rebuild or anything like that, but the reality is, you realize you have to change some things around there to be SEC ready. So overall, are they SEC ready? I would say yes. I would say they're, for the most part, I feel very confident that Texas is going to walk into the SEC and be a big-time player for them. But the reality is, these are uncharted territories. These are pressures that a lot of these players, Steve Sarkisian, Texas as a whole, has not experienced in a very, very long time. So how they deal with that will be incredible to watch. But they're one of those teams that, when you look at preseason rankings, when you look at those, preseason magazines and all of that type of stuff, you're going to look at it and say Texas is, one of the best teams in the country, and you're not wrong by any means. But there are a lot of things that go beyond, the roster and the head coach and the NIL and all of the infrastructure in place that go into winning the SEC. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think they're a team that, they've misstepped one time, I promise you there are going to be a lot of people coming after them very quickly. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. But we're going to take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about recruiting. A huge weekend this past weekend, and a lot of big-time news coming out of it. We definitely have a ton to cover with a ton of big-time players. So let's waste no more time. Let's take our break right here, and then we'll be back right with that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back, everyone. We just talked about some of the different things going on with Texas, and are they ready for the SEC? It's something that I think a lot of people are hoping the answer is no to, but definitely a team that has a lot of expectations going into this year and a lot of really good things in place. There's no two ways about that. So But let's break down some recruiting. There is so much going on in the recruiting trail. We talked about it last week that June is the month. There is so much going to be going on. There's going to be flips. There's going to be tons of recruiting visits, tons of rumors, and a lot of stuff to keep track of. But I promise that I will do that for you, so no worries about that. But it's already started. A lot of the June craziness has already gotten here, and it's definitely something that is going to affect a lot going forward. So I want to start to break this down, and let's start with Keelan Russell. This is one of the biggest quarterbacks in the entire country. I believe ranked number 7 over there at 247 Sports, but he's someone that I had tied to Texas in the past. I thought that Texas was really pushing for this kid, especially because they were pushing for his teammate, DeCorian Moore, at the wide receiver position. I thought it was possible they take him, KJ Lacey decommits, and he finds his way to Bama. Well, it sounds like Bama might just want Keelan Russell, and it sounds like they might just get him. Steve Wiltfong, in fact, put a crystal ball in for him to flip this weekend, so it's possible that the SMU commit might not be that way for any longer. He took a trip to Bama this past weekend, so obviously they made a pretty good impression. There's no two ways about that. Having Michael Penix on the recruiting card for Kalen DeBoer is a huge, huge thing for him going forward, and definitely something that I'm sure helped Keelan Russell maybe be a little bit more inclined to be a Crimson Tide in the future. So there's tons of teams to watch here still. Nothing's set in stone until these guys sign, but you have Florida, Ole Miss, Oregon, and many others in on this conversation, trying to steal him away from SMU, and SMU trying to hold on for dear life. But it looks like Alabama is, really setting the tone here. I think if another team I would watch closely is Ole Miss, just because Lane Kiffin can do some really, really remarkable things on the recruiting trail, especially at the quarterback position. So I would lean that he is going to flip to Alabama and likely be there at the end of this entire cycle, but who knows? There's still a lot of time, and definitely will be an interesting thing to watch. But there are some people in Dallas that are definitely biting their fingernails, hoping that they do not lose this kid to Alabama. But let's move on to David Sanders, one of the most talented offensive tackles in the country. I believe he's like 6'8", 350, just an absolute beast. So someone that is one of the most talked about recruits in the country, and especially over the past recent weeks, because early on, it was all Clemson. It felt like he was going to be a Clemson Tiger. Everything was, really trending in that direction. And then some teams started to come out of the woodwork, and it's the teams that you would expect. And it really starts with Georgia. It feels like that's the team that is pushing really, really aggressively for him. Now, there are still some teams that are absolutely in on this conversation. Clemson and Georgia are kind of sitting third, it seems, at least according to Anna Adams over at 247 Sports. She said that Tennessee might be the team that's up top. Ohio State might be number 2. But also, all 4 of these teams are very much in on this conversation. This is a guy that is going to be very, very highly sought after, but this is not good news for Clemson. Whenever you get a recruit that it seems like he's trending in one direction, trending towards your school, and then you hear a couple other schools start to come into the fray, and you start to fall down those rankings a little bit, it's definitely not what you want, and especially from Clemson's perspective, because when you look at their offensive line recruiting over the last couple of years, particularly last year, it did not go the way they wanted to by any means. And this is a guy that you could absolutely subside some of those worries and be a building block for a number of years to come. So a huge blow to Clemson, and if they can't get this guy on campus, they're going to have to go all out for some other big-time offensive linemen in this class. But this is a Kelvin Banks, Will Campbell type guy who can jump onto the page and start as a freshman, play some really good football, and then make his way down the road to some really, really high draft pick, honestly. I think the ceiling is absolutely through the roof. I know there are some people that are a little bit concerned about him playing tackle at the next level because of the mobility, but I do think he's a very talented kid that absolutely could be a three-year starter and then find his way off to the NFL. And then you had some other teams that made some noise. Michigan turning up the heat, trying to get a little bit better at recruiting. In the Jim Harbaugh era, it was a lot about, we're going to get 20 to 15. That's where we're going to rank in the kind of class rankings for the recruiting, and then we're going to develop, and we're going to do an incredible job at that, and we're going to build really good teams. Sherrone Moore seems to be a little bit more inclined to attack recruiting a little bit more aggressively. I think they're trying to get up into that top 10. Usually the top teams find themselves between 7 and 1. That's usually where you kind of want to find yourself, usually, top 5 if I'm being totally honest, but For Michigan, it's about, making those steps forward, and it seems like they're trying to do that for sure. Another team kicking into high gear is USC, and they have a little bit to worry about with some of these guys, including that guy right there, Justice Terry. He's someone that committed to them after, I believe he was committed to Georgia. He might have just been, leaning that direction. I can't exactly remember right this second, but a very, very talented defensive lineman that USC just plainly needs. They need as many of these big-time guys as they possibly can. They're also going after Isaiah Gibson, another guy that is very, very talented on the defensive line, and if they can lock in both those guys, if they can keep them committed and get them to sign, it's going to be an incredible class. I have no doubts about that. But Georgia's pushing really hard for both these guys, and when Kirby Smart is in on the conversation, you get a little bit nervous, that's for sure. And then they're going after a couple of safeties. They're going after Jonah Williams, who's one of the most talented safeties in the entire country, and definitely they're picking up ground there on guys like Oklahoma and A&M, but at the end of the day, Trey McNutt is the guy to really watch here. He is out of Shaker Heights, Ohio, and definitely someone that it felt like Ohio State was going to win out on, if I'm being totally honest. That's the way I think a lot of people were leaning. That's the way I was leaning for quite some time, but USC is making a big-time push here. So it feels like USC is doing the things that they need to do. They're checking off the boxes of, we're attacking the defensive side of the ball more aggressively than we have in the past, and they absolutely need to. So it's going to be fascinating to watch if they can pull in some of these guys. If they can't, then you might have a little bit of worry, but it seems like they're, at the very least, trying to bring in all these guys, and as long as they can keep one of Justice Terry or Isaiah Gibson in this class, it will be fantastic. But if they lose them both, then you got some questions down in Southern California about, what you're selling, are people buying, essentially. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. Then we got a couple of rapid-fire things here. Michael Fafusi, a very, very talented offensive lineman, a guy that seems to be leading, it seems like Texas is leading for this kid and has been for quite some time, but he's making visits around. Oregon is pushing very, very aggressively for this kid among a number of teams, so he's going to start making his official visits throughout this month and definitely will be a big-time player for whoever he goes to. I would lean towards Texas right this moment, but those official visits are hugely important. Another guy that Texas is in on is Riley Pettijohn, a very, very talented linebacker, 4-star. He has set his top 4 schools, and they are Ohio State, USC, Texas A&M, and Texas. It gives you another idea where USC is at in their recruiting cycle. They are just going after everyone they can on the defensive side of the ball, and they're doing a really good job of selling it, at least thus far. It seems like one of the Texas schools might win out here. I think Ohio State is pushing really, really aggressively for him. But being a Texas kid, it feels like the Texas A&M Texas type battle here, and it'll be fascinating to see who wins out, because I think this is a kid that could walk in and possibly start as a freshman in the SEC. I think that's how talented he is. Really, really athletic, can do some really remarkable things on the football field. So it will be interesting to see what happens there. And then you got Caleb Cunningham, one of the most talented wide receivers in the entire country. And for a long time in his recruitment, it felt like it was a Mississippi battle, Ole Miss or Mississippi State. Now it sounds like Auburn might be the number one. In fact, he said as much after this weekend he visited there, and it sounds like they made quite the impression. So maybe this is a little bit more of a 3-horse race from now on, and Auburn seems to be in kind of the catbird seat right now. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. There's so much stuff going on around recruiting, and tons of people had big-time recruiting weekends. Miami had big-time players in town, but Bama also did. We talked about Keelan Russell. They also had Jordan Davison, a 4-star running back, Ty Haywood, 5-star lineman, Derek Smith, one of the best athletes in the entire country. So Kalen DeBoer is putting in a lot of effort to curb some of that, recruiting talk that was happening when he took that job over at Bama. LSU also had a huge weekend. D.A. Pickett, who is someone they really need over there at LSU and seem to be leading for, at least as of right now. The 5-star corner was there. Kalik Lockett, Jamie French, Dorian Brew, all those guys were there. So very, very good group over there in LSU, and hopefully they made some impressions, especially on Jamie French and Kalik Lockett, because some of those guys seem to be trending towards Texas, and they'd love to steal them away from an SEC rival, that's for sure. So definitely going to be a lot of updates throughout this month. We'll likely do this probably once a week, because there's going to be tons of stuff happening, flips and visits and murmurs and everything in between. So we'll definitely keep you updated with all of that stuff throughout everything that happens throughout this month. But we're going to take our last break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some players that can make some big-time money this year in the NFL. You know, you always have that breakout year. Jaden Daniels made a ton of money this past year when he won the Heisman and became the number 2 quarterback off the board. So definitely a lot of guys that are slated to do that this upcoming year. So we'll break that down right after this. So stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the recruiting weekend, how big it was, and how there were some big time headlines coming out. Keelan Russell might just be flipping from SMU to Bama, so we'll keep you updated on all of that as it comes out. But let's get into some of the players that can make a lot of money this upcoming year. There are always some players in their contract years going into college football. We talked about Quinn Ewers early in the show. Absolutely a contract year for him, but a contract year for a number of other players that can make some big time money if they have big time 2024. So let's start to break down these guys. And what I want to start with here is Cam Ward. I feel like this is the obvious one. This is the one that I feel very confident in putting in here because when you talk about a kid that absolutely could make NFL GMs and head coaches fall in love with him, I think he might be at the top of the list. We saw Jaden Daniels a year ago. One of the great things about him was his ability to extend plays and make throws on the run and do some of the things that, you know, pop off the page when you're watching his film. There's no two ways about that. I think Cam Ward can do the exact same thing this year. He did flirt with the NFL draft this past cycle, but decided to come back, and I think he made the absolute right decision. I think he has the ability to kind of fill a void. You know, that when you look at this quarterback class this upcoming year, I tend to lean that it's Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, and then you have a little bit of an opening, but at the end of the day, he could absolutely jump Quinn Ewers. He could absolutely jump Carson Beck. So he could be a dude that could do incredible things, especially if Miami goes to the ACC title, wins it, goes to the playoff, does some really remarkable things. Cam Ward's going to be at the center of it. And I think he's someone that right now, if you were ranking the quarterbacks for next year, might sit somewhere around QB6, QB7, but could absolutely make his way up into the 2-3 spot by the end of the year. So very, very excited for him. Definitely someone that could be making quite a bit of money this time next year. But let's move on over and let's talk about Jaden Blue. Very, very talented running back out of Texas. This is a guy that I think is being a little bit overlooked because of all the talk around CJ Baxter. Had a fantastic freshman year and is a very, very good running back. There's no two ways about that. That two-headed monster is going to be very, very tough to defend. But when you talk about Jaden Blue, I think he has a different gear. He has speed that is just remarkable to watch, is probably the better pass catcher between the two, and is definitely someone that I think when you look at Texas this year, it's going to be a lot about getting guys out on the edge. It's going to be a lot of speed, which it is a lot of the time with Steve Sarkisian, but even more this year, I think it's going to be a lot of just spreading defenses out, making sure that they get the ball to all the playmakers they can because they have a ton of them. And I think Jaden Blue is going to be one of those guys that shows his versatility, shows the speed, and when that guy hits a B gap on a outside run, if you don't tackle him at the line of scrimmage, he's going to gain at least 20 yards, and he might just be gone for a touchdown. So he's a remarkable kid. I think he's someone that could be one of the big-time players in college football this upcoming year. But let's move on over to UNLV and let's talk about Ricky White. This is one of my favorite players in the entire country, one of the best receivers in the entire country, and definitely a guy that is already getting some looks on the NFL boards, but definitely could find his way up there. When you talk about this wide receiver class, it looks like it's going to be Luther Burden, it's going to be Tatori McMillan, and then wide open. You can kind of play around Emeka Egbuka, Isaiah Bond. There's definitely some guys in there, but Ricky White is one that absolutely could make some noise and maybe find his way up into that conversation because UNLV has a big season ahead of them. They came off a trip to the Mountain West Championship a year ago. If they go back this upcoming year and win it, they might just make it into the playoff as the group of 5 team, and Ricky White would be at the very center of that. He kind of reminds me of a Malachi Corley, a little bit more of a tactician in terms of route running, is a very, very sure-handed wide receiver. So a guy that a team could absolutely fall in love with and is going to play a huge part in this UNLV offense, that's for sure. So definitely very fascinated in him. Cannot wait to see what he does this year. But let's move on to tight end, and let's talk about Justin Joly, a very, very talented kid that came over from UConn to NC State this last year, and he's someone that, when you talk about tight ends in the NFL draft over the past couple of years, it's just been pick the athlete and let the rest of it figure itself out. And this is about as good of an athlete as you have at tight end in the entire country this year. So I think he's someone that's going to be huge for NC State. Much like we talked about Texas, I think NC State's going to do the same thing with Kevin Concepcion, with Noah Rogers. They're going to try to stretch you out. They're going to try to make sure that open middle of the field, that seam route is wide open. And if it is, Justin Joly is going to have a fantastic year. The tight ends in this class, it's going to be Colston Loveland. It's going to be Mitchell Evans leading the way. But Justin Joly is a guy that absolutely could make his way into that conversation big time this upcoming year. But let's move to offensive line. And let's talk about Ernest Green. This is a guy that, if you're a Georgia fan, frankly, if you're an SEC fan, you probably know this name, but he absolutely is going to be a huge part of what Georgia does this upcoming season, can do things that are just remarkable. And I think when you talk about offensive tackles this upcoming year, it's Kelvin Banks, it's Will Campbell, and then you're trying to figure out that third spot. This is a guy that you absolutely could put there. He's very, very talented, and I think when we look at the next year's class, he could be kind of a J.C. Latham guy. Maybe he jumps one of these guys where last year when we went into this conversation, it was Joe Alt, it was Olu Fashanu, and then J.C. Latham found his way into that mix. So it'll be interesting to watch what Ernest Green can do. I think he's very, very talented and can run block, can pass block, and especially if you're on a national title team, you're going to have a little bit of a boost as well. So that doesn't hurt by any means. But let's move to the defensive side of the ball, and let's start interior defensive line. A former Georgia player in Bear Alexander, I think, could have a huge year for USC. Last year, it just wasn't quite what he wanted it to be, and I think a lot of that was because there weren't a lot of people around him to demand the attention that he needs. He was getting a lot of doubles, a lot of guys that were just trying to shut him down, knowing that they could handle the defensive tackles and the defensive ends one-on-one. But he's someone that I think is going to get more one-on-ones this year because USC has done a better job building out that defensive line the way that they want it. And I think it's going to be one of those things where you can guard this guy in doubles. You can't really guard him in one-on-one. So the more one-on-ones he gets, the more dominant he's going to be. And I think he's going to be someone that is absolutely a huge part of USC's success. Now, is he going to change their season? I don't necessarily know, but he's definitely someone that I think could be just game-wrecking for them pretty much the entire year. And then let's get to edge, and Jordan Burch feels like the obvious pick to me. I think the last couple of years have been a little bit tough on him. He transferred over from South Carolina, didn't necessarily catch on the way he wanted to at Oregon, but this feels like the year. I think when you look at the past Oregon teams, not a lot of interior defensive line force, and that doesn't necessarily help the edge rushing by any means because you have more reinforcements to kind of kick out that direction, and I think Jordan Burch got hurt by that. But now you have everything in place. You have Jamari Caldwell, you have Derek Harmon on the interior. You also have Mateo Uyunglele on the other side, who is a remarkable player that I think will definitely be a big part of this as well. But I think Jordan Burch is a very physical player. He can do a lot of really remarkable things, can run, defend, is a good pass rusher, but I think he's someone that when you're an NFL GM and you see that type of NFL body at the edge rushing position, you're going to make a case for why you should draft him. So I'm very excited to see what he can do this season. I think he could be as big of a part of Oregon's success as really anyone on that team. But let's get to Harold Perkins. This one's a little bit obvious. I think he's already very high on NFL boards. I'll be totally honest. I think NFL teams are really looking at him and fully understand how good he is, even though he wasn't necessarily utilized the right way last season. But I do think 2024 could be a huge year for him, because I think when you look at this this LSU team, it's not the defense that you want it to be. And it wasn't a year ago, but this year it feels like Harold Perkins is going to be asked to be a lot of different things, and he is very versatile. There's no two ways about that, and he's going to be asked to be the linchpin of that defense. And if he is that, and if LSU can put together a top 50 defense, a top 40 defense, where they're not going to be necessarily dominant, but they could be a good defense. There's definitely still some guys on this roster that absolutely can make some plays, but if they're going to be that, Harold Perkins is going to be a big reason for that, maybe the reason for that, if I'm being totally honest. So he's going to be someone I'm fascinated to watch. I think he's going to be just incredible this upcoming year, and might just be the number one defensive player off the board. Might just knock James Pierce Jr. or Abdul Carter or some of the other guys that are being kicked around off that pedestal just because of just how remarkable he is. Just cannot wait to watch this kid this upcoming year. But let's move on to corner, and let's talk about Noah Igbinosun, because everyone talks about Denzel Burke, and for good reason. One of the best corners in the entire country. Everyone talks about Caleb Downs, and for good reason. One of the best safeties in the entire country. But I think when you talk about this OSU back end and you talk about how incredible it is, it's not necessarily because of those two guys. It's because of the 4 or 5 or 6 guys that are right there next to him, and Noah Igbinosun kind of leads that list. I think he is just it's Davison Igbinosun. Noah Igbinosun was on Auburn. That was a little bit of a brain fart. I apologize for that. But a very talented player nonetheless. He can do just really, really remarkable things this upcoming season. And especially being the number 2 behind Denzel Burke gives him a little bit more leeway. You know, you can be a little bit more dominant against some of the smaller, some of the not as talented wide receivers that he's going to face. So Davison Igbinosun is someone that absolutely could make a lot of noise this upcoming season. So very excited to see what he can do. I think when you talk about this Ohio State back end, he might be one of the most important players to it. And then Rod Moore. I couldn't find a picture of him in an Alabama jersey, so I figured this would do. He transferred over to Alabama from Michigan this past spring, and definitely is someone that just kind of saw an opening and an opportunity and took full advantage. He went over to Bama, and he's going to be starting for them year one. I have very, very few doubts about that. I think he's remarkably talented. And when you have Malachi Moore on that back end, it's going to be a really, really good group. I think he might just be a better player than Malachi Moore, at least on NFL draft boards. He's currently ranked higher, that's for sure. So he's someone that can do a lot of really remarkable things, is good in coverage, is good against the run, can do a lot of great things. And I think being at Bama, especially next to someone like Malachi Moore, he'll have a little bit more ability to set his feet at one position and do a lot of really remarkable things. I don't know if it's going to be free safety, boundary safety, or what, but he's definitely going to be a big player for them, and they kind of need him to be. So very excited to see this group kind of build out. I think there are a lot of people on this list that I could have included that popped into my head, but I wanted to do one per position just to give you guys an idea. Maybe it's something that we'll continue to do because it's a pretty fun practice, and definitely a lot of guys that can make a ton of money this upcoming season. So it'll be fascinating to watch those guys. It'll be fascinating to watch just anyone that pops up out of nowhere, kind of like what Jaden Daniels did a year ago. So it'll be interesting to watch all that, but that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need, whether it's hockey, golf, we're getting tennis here pretty soon, women's sports, it does not matter. We have it all covered over here. So come on over to GSMC and we can give you whatever you need. So thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.